The kidnapped heiress he hid in his cabin, and she discovered the fat recluse has the bravest heart. Take one more step, and I'll throw myself into the gorge before I let you touch me. The wind tore Cordelia Whitfield's words across the Appalachian dark like a ragged banner. October 1883. Rain needled the pines, thunder stitched the ridgelines with white fire. Below, a derailed private coach lay canted in blackberry bramble, its brass railings bent like broken music. Gunfire popped somewhere down the track, Silas Blackwood's men sweeping the trees, calling her name as if it already belonged to them. Cordelia's silk had become rags. One shoe was a ghost of itself. Blood ticked warm along her temple. She stumbled blind through spruce and laurel until the earth slid out from under her. The world pitched, stone, sky, a taste of iron, and then a shadow filled the storm. A giant of a man with a beard like rusted wool, rain streaming from his coat, eyes deep as root cellars. He knelt, so gently it felt like a promise, and the last thing she knew was being lifted as if she were made of breath. They say no one ventures into these mountains after midnight unless they're hunting or being hunted. But you, where are you listening from as this begins? Cordelia Whitfield had been raised to believe the world could be made to behave if you held your chin high enough. Her cradle was a Pullman car, and her playground a string of depots stitched from her father's fortune. In Boston, finishing schools, they taught her French verbs and the art of smiling without showing teeth. In Charleston parlors, they praised her for being well-bred as a thoroughbred. The Whitfield name opened doors faster than keys. It also closed windows on curiosity, on disobedience, on the right to be afraid. Beneath the polish, she carried private fault lines. Light hurt her when headaches came. She hid them behind lace veils and practiced walking as if pain were only posture. Pride was her second corset. She hated the way men spoke of railroads as if they were veins in a body they owned, and of her as if she were merely a dowry that could speak. The journey south should have been routine, a private carriage, 4 armed guards, letters of introduction wrapped in ribbon. Then the night unspooled, a shudder through the track, the scream of steel, a thunder of hooves, and faces she did not know raised against her like a verdict. Someone shouted her name as if it were a price. Pistols cracked. One guard fell as neatly as a cut rope. Another's lantern spun wild and died. Cordelia ran, the hem of her traveling dress snagging on laurel, gloves ripping at the seams. Rain blew her lamp out with a single cold breath. Somewhere behind, a whistle keened and went silent, like a throat cut. She told herself she was not frightened, only determined. She told herself many things while branches took her hairpins and mud took her shoes. When she slipped, when dark and earth collided and the sky swung like a door on a broken hinge, her last clear thought was not of ransom or reputation, but of a Boston afternoon when she had stood by the Charles and wished, to her own shock, that she might once be needed for herself rather than her father's signature. She woke to warmth, a low room of rough-hewn pine, the glow of a hearth, her head bound, her body in unfamiliar flannel that did not belong to money, and in the doorway, filling it, a stranger, massive, rain-damp, watchful, as out of place beside a cradle of fire as a mountain beside a tea-table. "Where am I?" she rasped, fingers clenched in the quilt. The giant's voice came quiet, careful, as if he were measuring doses. "Safe enough, for now." Tobias Crane looked nothing like safety, though he had given it to her. He filled the cabin's doorway like a thundercloud, broad shoulders darkened by rain, beard a tangle of auburn and ash, hands rough as bark. Yet the first thing Cordelia noticed was not his size, but the care with which he moved, deliberate, quiet, as if the floor itself might bruise under his weight. "I've found you by the gorge," he said, setting a tray on the table, broth, bread, and a cup that steamed faintly of herbs. His voice was deep but hesitant, a baritone that seemed trained long ago for lecterns, not wilderness. "You struck your head. I thought you were dead till you coughed." Cordelia studied him, wary. His clothes were simple, clean, but mended many times. He carried no pistol, only a hunting knife at his belt and the smell of pine smoke. "You live here alone?" she asked. Tobias nodded. "For 7 years." "Why?" He didn't answer at first. He poured water from a kettle into a basin, testing it with one calloused finger, then handed her a cloth. "It's quieter here," he said at last. "The mountains don't ask questions I don't wish to answer." But later, when she was strong enough to walk to the porch and saw the valley falling away below like a green sea, she learned more. He had once been a teacher at a Virginia college, dismissed after a false accusation by a senator's daughter. "They needed a monster," he said simply, eyes on the tree line. "I fit the shape they drew." He had come north, built the cabin with his own hands, and lived by trapping, carving, and reading the books he'd salvaged. Inside, the shelves were crowded, philosophy, botany, poetry. Beneath the dust, the man was scholar and craftsman both. When he bandaged her wounds, he apologized each time his fingers brushed her skin. When she shivered, he stoked the fire twice, though the sweat ran down his temples. And once, when she dropped her hairbrush, he stooped to pick it up, enormous fingers cradling it as if it were glass. Cordelia realized then that his strength had edges of mercy, that the world had mistaken stillness for dullness, solitude for sin. He placed the brush back on the table, eyes averted, voice low. "You don't owe me trust, Miss Whitfield," he said. "Only time." She wanted to ask what he meant, but the words lodged somewhere behind her ribs. He turned back to the fire, and for the first time since the wreck, Cordelia felt her heartbeat slow to something almost human. Days became a rhythm of small mercies. The storm outside waned, but inside Tobias Crane's cabin the world softened into ordinary miracles. The hiss of water boiling over pine wood, the scratch of a pen on paper, the low hum he made unconsciously when he worked. Cordelia, who had never known quiet that wasn't artificial, began to hear the language of stillness. In the mornings, Tobias split wood, while mist crept through the valley like spilled milk. Cordelia would watch from the porch, wrapped in his flannel coat. Each swing of his axe looked deliberate, reverent even, and though he dwarfed everything around him, he seemed to harm nothing. When she offered to help cook, he smiled, shy, almost startled. "I wouldn't have thought a Whitfield could handle a skillet," he teased gently. "Then you underestimate my education," she replied, daring a smile back. It was the first time either had laughed aloud since the night of the crash. Gradually, her fear faded into curiosity. Tobias showed her his garden, rows of hardy greens between rocks, thyme and sage growing in tin pails. He pointed out wild herbs in the forest and told her their uses: comfrey for wounds, foxglove for hearts that misbehaved. "Nature is neither cruel nor kind," he said, crouching beside a sprig of lavender. "It just offers what it has. The cruelty comes from how we take it. At night, they read by the same lamp. His voice, slow and resonant, filled the room as he recited lines from Paradise Lost. Sometimes, Cordelia drifted to sleep in the armchair, the cadence of his reading blending with the crackle of the fire. He would pause then, drape a blanket over her shoulders, and sit back without a sound. That was their silent bonding, two souls keeping company with nothing but the music of flame and breath. One evening, rain returned, hard and cold. The roof began to leak above her bed. Tobias climbed up in the dark, hammer in hand. She called after him, but he only laughed. "A few drops won't drown a mountain, Miss Whitfield." When he came back, soaked to the bone, she insisted on drying his hair herself. Standing behind him, her fingers threaded through the thick strands. His hair smelled of smoke and pine. For a moment, he closed his eyes. "Cordelia," he said quietly, "no one's touched me in kindness for years." Her hands stilled, trembling. "Then you've been living in the wrong kind of silence." That night, neither of them spoke again. The fire spoke for them, a steady, breathing glow that bridged the distance between their chairs. Weeks passed. Her head healed, but something else grew in its place, a tenderness she could neither name nor deny. She began to see the beauty in the very things she once feared, the breadth of his shoulders when he worked, the gentleness in his gestures, the patience in his pauses. Tobias, unaware of her gaze, would sometimes hum a hymn under his breath, and she thought his voice the kindest sound she had ever heard. The turning point came on a morning glazed with frost. Cordelia slipped on the porch step, her ankle twisting. Tobias caught her mid-fall, his arm around her waist. For one breathless second, their eyes met. Her fear reflected in his, but behind it, something steady, protective, and alive. She didn't see a recluse then. She didn't see a giant. She saw the safest place she had ever stood. And when he set her down gently, his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Forgive me," he murmured. "I didn't mean to frighten you." "You didn't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not any more." Outside, the frost began to melt, a slow, quiet thaw that felt like spring daring to return. Peace rarely lasts long in the wild. By mid-November, the mountain wind had turned sharp, and so had Tobias's unease. The woods had gone silent, no birdsong, no deer prints, only the cold hush that comes before danger. He found boot tracks near the stream. Too many? Too deep? Silas Blackwood's men had come back. That evening, he told Cordelia the truth. "They're hunting again. I reckon they've learned you didn't die in that wreck." Her face blanched, but she didn't flinch. "What will they do if they find us?" "They'll trade you for gold," he said grimly, "and kill me for the trouble." Cordelia gripped the edge of the table. "Then we can't let them." Tobias looked at her, this woman who had once shrunk from him, and saw steel under the silk. "You trust me that much?" "With my life," she answered. They packed what little they could, dried food, his rifle, her courage. Tobias showed her the hidden path behind the ridge, away to the cave where he kept emergency stores. "If I say run, you run there. Don't look back." But fate, as always, had its own map. Before dawn, dogs bayed in the distance. The smell of smoke reached them. The cabin was being surrounded. Tobias's jaw tightened. "There's no time." He pressed his revolver into her palm. "You remember how to use it?" She nodded, voice shaking. "You taught me." "Then listen now. Whatever happens, you live. You hear me? You live." Moments later, boots crashed through the clearing. Silas's laughter led them. "Well, look at this," he sneered, stepping out from the shadows. "The Whitfield princess kept warm by a beast. How touching." Cordelia stood her ground. "You won't touch him." Silas smirked. "He's already dead." The fight began before she could blink. Tobias moved like the mountain itself, slow until it wasn't, unstoppable when it was. His fist met Silas's jaw. A man fell. Another's rifle cracked. Smoke and thunder blurred together. Cordelia fired once into the air. Panic scattered half the men. But Silas was a serpent, quick and cruel. His shot hit Tobias's shoulder, spinning him backward. "Tobias!" she screamed, but he stayed on his feet, staggering toward her. "Go!" he roared. "I won't leave you." "Then the world wins," he said through his teeth. "And I didn't fight all this time just to let them win." Silas raised his pistol again, smirking through blood. "She'll forget you in a month, fat man." Cordelia stepped between them. "Try me." She pulled the trigger. The echo cracked across the valley like thunder after lightning. Silas fell, eyes wide, surprise frozen on his lips. When the smoke cleared, Tobias sank to his knees, breathing hard. Blood soaked his shirt, but his eyes stayed on her. "You shouldn't have—" She knelt beside him. "You saved me. You taught me to fight. This was my turn." For a long time, neither spoke. The forest did their talking. Wind in branches, rain beginning again. Tobias's head leaned against her shoulder, heavy but alive. "You're shaking," he murmured. "So are you." "Then we're even." By sunrise, the sheriff's posse, sent by her father, found them half-conscious beside the ruined cabin. Smoke still curled from the chimney. Silas's men were gone or bound. Cordelia wouldn't let them move Tobias until he woke. When he finally did, she smiled through tears. "You said not to look back, but if I hadn't, I'd have lost everything worth looking forward to." He managed a weak grin. "Reckon that's the first argument you've won against me." When Tobias awoke again, it was to the scent of antiseptic and magnolias. For the first time in years, he was not in his cabin. He was in a whitewashed room in Charleston, the curtains drawn wide to let in a gentle southern sun. Cordelia was there, sitting beside him in a chair too fine for a recluse's comfort, but softened by her presence. Her hair was unbound, her face pale with worry, but alive with relief. "You made it," she whispered. He swallowed hard. "Didn't expect to wake in a palace." "It's my father's home," she said, half smiling. "He brought us here. You're safe, Tobias." The door opened then, and a man entered, tall, silver-haired, dressed in the unmistakable precision of wealth. Harrison Whitfield's expression was carved from granite, but his eyes softened when they met Tobias's. "I owe you my daughter's life," he said simply. "No man has ever given me a debt like that." Tobias tried to sit up, grimacing at the pain in his shoulder. "You owe me nothing, sir. I only did what any decent man would have done." Whitfield shook his head. "Decent men are plentiful. Brave ones are not." He hesitated, then added quietly, "My daughter tells me she intends to marry you. I won't stand in her way." Cordelia's breath caught, her hand finding Tobias's. The old man turned and left without another word, but when the door shut, she began to cry, quiet tears of release, of victory. "He said yes," she whispered, laughing through the sobs. "I think I shocked him into sense." Tobias reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with fingers that trembled. "You don't have to do this, Cordelia. The world will talk." "Let them," she said fiercely. "They've been talking my whole life. Let them finally talk about something true." Spring came early that year. They were married beneath an oak draped in Spanish moss, the air perfumed with wisteria and river salt. No cathedral, no diamonds, just wildflowers, sunlight, and the murmur of waves against the dock. When she walked down the aisle toward him, barefoot and radiant, Tobias forgot the ache of every lonely year. Their vows were simple, Cordelia's voice steady, though her hands trembled. You found me when I was lost, and you taught me that love doesn't come from fear. You have the bravest heart I've ever known. And Tobias, eyes shining, answered, You saw a man where the world saw a monster. You gave me back my name, my worth, and my peace. Afterward, they moved to a house on the edge of the marshlands, part home, part refuge. Tobias rebuilt the cabin plank by plank, this time not to hide, but to welcome. They opened its doors to lost travelers, to the poor, to children who needed schooling. Cordelia turned the front room into a small library. Tobias grew vegetables in the back garden. At night, they would sit on the porch, fireflies pulsing in the reeds, the air thick with honeysuckle. He would carve wood while she read aloud, philosophy, poetry, even the railroad news she once found tedious. The rhythm of their lives was slow, deliberate, and good. Sometimes she would rest her head against his shoulder and say, Do you ever miss the mountains? He would smile, watching the moon rise over the water. Not any more. You brought them to me. And on quiet nights, when thunder rolled far away, Tobias would close his eyes, listen to the rain, and feel her hand slip into his, a reminder that even the fiercest storms can lead two souls home. Years passed, and the story of Tobias Crane and Cordelia Whitfield became something whispered across Charleston verandas and mountain taverns alike, half legend, half reminder. They said the railroad heiress had married the fat recluse of the hills, that she'd traded silk for soil and diamonds for decency. But those who saw them together knew the truth. She hadn't given up a world. She had chosen one. Tobias never returned to teaching, though universities wrote to him, inviting him to lecture again. I'm teaching something else now, he would reply, motioning toward the children sitting cross-legged on the porch, learning to read from his worn copy of The Pilgrim's Progress. Lessons in kindness don't need a blackboard. Cordelia, once the portrait of a perfect lady, now wore linen aprons and freckles from the sun. She oversaw the little school they built, wrote letters to governors demanding better wages for miners, and laughed when Tobias pretended to grumble about her revolutionary streak. You started it, she'd say, brushing sawdust from his shoulder. You taught me courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stays. Every so often she would catch him staring at her as if still surprised she hadn't vanished. What is it? She'd ask. He'd shrug, smile slow and shy. Just making sure you're real. And she'd answer, I was never real until I met you. When storms swept in from the sea, Tobias would bar the shutters and light the fire. They'd sit together in that flickering glow, and she would rest her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm beneath. Still brave, she'd whisper, still beautiful. And so the years folded quietly into peace. If you ask what became of them, the locals will tell you this. The Whitfield Crane house still stands, its porch sagging but sturdy. Children still play by the garden Tobias planted, where herbs and wildflowers grow side by side, and carved into the lintel, weathered by sun and rain, are the words he once said to her when the world called him monster. It's not the face that frightens people, It's the heart that dares to be good when they cannot. Because, in the end, the bravest hearts are rarely the prettiest ones. But they are the ones that keep the rest of us alive. The night settles softly over Charleston now, waves licking the harbor walls, magnolia petals drifting like memory through the dark. Somewhere out near the marsh, a lamp still burns in the window of the old Crane house, its light steady, patient, as if it's still waiting for someone lost in the storm to find their way home. They say if you walk by quietly enough, you can still hear laughter through the open shutters, the sound of a woman reading aloud, the creak of a chair where a great gentleman once sat, carving bits of cedar into tiny wooden hearts. And maybe that's all their story ever was, a reminder that love doesn't arrive wearing crowns or titles, but calluses and courage, that the bravest acts are sometimes nothing more than choosing to see beauty where others refuse to look. So, if you've stayed until the end, if you still believe that kindness can save, that courage can grow in silence, that love can bloom even in exile, then tell me, where are you right now as this story ends? Are you somewhere safe and warm, or somewhere you're still waiting to be found?